we've assumed that things have to be ordered, both for a good reason and a bad reason. And the good reason is that we need to find things, and to do that you need a principle of organization that you know and you can figure out where to look for stuff. That, of course, makes total sense. The bad reason is that we have assumed that things really fit into an order of the universe. And traditionally in the West, and it's only been in the past 100 years that this has weakened its grip on us at all, but for 2,400 years we've assumed that to know what something is to know its place in the order of the universe, a perfect order in which everything has a place and only one place and one right place. That is not a helpful assumption. We got to that because when you are organizing physical objects, whether it's books in a library or it's spices in a kitchen, you have to make a decision about a single principle of organization. So if you want to organize your books alphabetically, but your spouse wants to do it by topic, only one of you can win. You cannot do both. If you want to organize your spices by area of the world, and your spouse wants to do it by is it a hot spice? Is it a savory spice? Only one of you can win, and so we have these arguments. In the digital world, that goes away because we can have multiple orders of organization at the same time. And our notion that things have a proper place, and to say what something is to say what its place in the world is, turns out to be an artifact of the limitations of the way we organize physical things. So I find it helpful to think about there being three orders of organization. And in the first order of organization, you organize the things themselves, the books on the shelf or spices on the rack. In the second order, it's important enough to you, and you have enough items, that you create a physically independent set of metadata. The classic example are catalog cards for a library, which some of us remember, most of us won't. Paper cards, each one representing a book. And if you do that, you can now have 3 cards for every book. So you have 3 principles of organization. And so people can look up the book by author alphabetically. They can look it up by subject alphabetically. They can look it up by title alphabetically. And that's 3 orders put on top. But in order to do that for the second order of organization, you have to reduce the amount of information to, in the case of a book, to what fits on a single card. Because otherwise you would have a card catalog that's as big as the library, and that's not helpful. And so we've thrown out all sorts of information. We've made very good decisions. I work in a library, so we've made very good decisions about what goes on that card. Really wise decisions, but we've had to throw out most of the information about the books, including all of the text. I mean, that just doesn't fit on the card. So we've paid a very serious price for this. So that's the second order of organization. And then you can digitize that as well, as libraries did in the 70s. They took their paper card catalogs and turned them into electronic catalogs, which made it easier to search. In the third order, everything is digital. It's not that you have the physical and object and the physical representation. Rather, everything is physical. The book, excuse me, everything is digital. The book is a digital object. The information about it is digital. And it all gets smushed together. This, I think, has led to a pretty fundamental change in how we think about metadata, which is information about information. So in the information age, back when we were designing, we had mainframes and the like, it seemed there was a very clear distinction between the data and the metadata. So the data would be for a personnel record, would be the person's name and address and when she started and so forth. The metadata would be the information that labels those columns. When you looked up a book in the library, you looked up the metadata. You looked up the author's name. That was metadata, and would get you to the book. That's how the second order works. But now that everything is becoming digital, that's an overstatement, but it's pretty much true. Everything's becoming digital. The distinction between metadata and data really doesn't hold up anymore. So now if you go to Google Books, for example, you can look up metadata in the standard way. But if you know the author's name and you want to find out what the book was, you type in the author's name and you get the book back. You don't just get the metadata back, by the way. You get back the book as long as it's licenses work. So let's say it's Moby Dick, which is in the public domain. You'll get back the entire text. But if you remember a little bit of the text, like the opening line, "Call me Ishmael," and you can't remember what book it's in, you type that into a search engine, and that becomes the metadata. And you'll get back the author's name and the entire text. In fact, you'll get back everything. You'll get back, because it's, it's a search engine, you'll get back the text, you'll get back a map to Herman Melville's house, you'll get his social network, who he hung out with, you'll get the maps to their houses in the Berkshires, you'll get back the biology of the whale, you'll get back the ecology of the whale, you'll get back Al Gore, you will get back everything. So it turns out the distinction between metadata and data is not this hard-coded thing as it was in the second order. The distinction is simply that metadata is the thing that you know, and data is what you're looking for. And if you know the author's name, then that's the metadata. And if you know the quote, then that's the metadata. And as a result, everything is metadata, which is really wonderful news, because we use metadata in the first place to pry up knowledge, to find something that we don't yet know. And if everything is metadata and everything's connected, then we just got much, much smarter. Everything can find everything else. That does, however, create an enormous mess, a disorder. And that's a terrible problem in the physical world. So if you take all the books in the library and you dump them off the shelves, and somebody comes in and says, I'd like to find Herman Melville, and you're the librarian, you're going to say, I'm sorry, it's going to take us a couple of years just to sort through. I mean, a mess is a terrible thing in the physical world. But it's a wonderful thing in the digital world, because the messiness of digital objects is caused by their vast linkedness. It's those so many links among so many things. We don't have to decide ahead of time what links matter. This has always been a problem when we've ordered and organized in the old ways. So we had to make a decision about what was the really important thing about an object. Is it its title? Is it the author's name? Is it the country? Is it the licensing? And we make good choices, but to do so we have to anticipate what our users are going to be interested in and how they're going to think about things. Nobody can do that. We are very squirrely species. It's really hard to predict what we're going to be interested in, what's going to matter to us. And the little thing that doesn't matter to you may turn out to have tremendous significance to me. We also don't know what history is going to do. So you may remember Sarah Palin, who ran for vice president in 2008, who was pretty much a disaster. She was an unknown politician. And as a result, if you were the person who was in charge of curating the collection of newspapers over the 1990s, you would never, ever, ever have preserved the meeting notes for the library committee in the little town in Alaska that she came from. You could not anticipate that Sarah Palin, who was involved apparently in some bad stuff in the library, that this would matter, that this would ever, ever matter. You cannot predict history. You cannot predict what's going to matter to people. But we've had to predict because we couldn't contain everything, because we didn't have enough space, and we'd have to decide what are the 10 different fields we're going to put on the library card. But we can't know what's going to matter. We just can't. I think it's John C. Lee Brown who gives the example of a book that smells like vinegar. And it turns out that indicates that the book was in a library during the age of cholera, where vinegar was thought to disinfect. I probably have that entirely wrong. Anything factual I get wrong immediately. Nobody would have predicted that that's interesting. Now we don't have to make those decisions. We can enable this enormous mess, and every link that somebody finds, most of them are good and interesting, some of them are completely personal and who cares, and some of them are just wrong. Every link now, every relationship is now accessible. That is a gigantic mess, but it's also a huge increase in the available meaning of things. So rather than having to strip things down to an essential set of properties, an essential set of metadata so that we can organize and find them, we can now be hugely inclusive. We can include everything in a big mess, allow more and more messiness to emerge, because every time somebody does a sort of local curation, they find 5 things that are interesting to them, you can reabsorb that fact back into the mess, and that mess gets richer and richer and richer. But it does mean that we have to provide tools for filtering, not on the way in, where the curator, the editor, the publisher decides what's important, but tools for filtering on the way out, so that the people who are using this mess can look at it and find what's interesting and important to them, much of which will be unpredictable. But finding what is interesting and unpredictable is at the core of innovation and understanding. And so this gigantic mess that we're enabling, this digital mess, this digital disorder, turns out, I think, to be both confusing and enriching. There are many examples of how we're doing this. And one of my favorite examples is the rise of tagging. So in the middle 2000s, tagging became quite popular and dominant, and it's sort of slipped from consciousness, but it's done so in a way that we're just not as aware of it, but it's become part of what we do. So for example, the new Apple operating system, Mavericks, has expanded the ability to use tags. So a tag is a little bit of text, a word or phrase that a user applies to some object. It might be a document on your computer, or it might be some post on the web or a scientific article that says what you think it's about in a way that you'll remember, so that you can find it again, and you can find all the items that have that same tag. So at Flickr, the photo sharing site, you tag things with whatever tags you want, and there's communal tagging. People can tag your photos whatever they want, because they may find something interesting in your photo that you didn't think was interesting. This is very, very different from the controlled vocabulary approach that has been typical for a long time, where a set of experts, and they are genuine experts, this is very difficult art, come up with a set of terms that they think are perfectly clear and unambiguous and will apply to everything in the domain. And you don't want to have more than one way of referring to things, because if you refer to them, let's say it's eBay, and you refer to them as laptops, as portables, and as, I don't know, people won't find. If they look for one term, they won't find the others. So in the traditional approach, you come up with a controlled vocabulary that covers the entire domain and does so in an unambiguous way. And there's great value to that. But it means that if you have a different way of thinking about the world, it won't work for you. There's also always politics involved in this. So one of the famous examples is photo collections from the 1950s had a controlled vocabulary. These are people who are selling stock photos or news photos. And they would use a controlled vocabulary to say that this is a picture of a woman. So you could search for these things. She's outside. And they had very few for women in professions. They had the tag housewife, which is no longer really a helpful way of thinking about women in our culture. There are inevitably controlled vocabularies express the way that we are thinking at the time, and thus contain things that we're embarrassed about later and are unhelpful to us later. So tagging takes a very different approach, which says we will not control the vocabulary, we will allow people to apply their own. Often it will be mysterious. If you look at somebody else's tag, you may not be able to figure out why it was tagged that way. It may be highly ambiguous. I may say SF, meaning this is a photo of San Francisco, and you may say SF because to you it's Sally Fields, or it's Santa Frisco, Santa Fernando. And you can't tell just by looking at those two letters. So it's way more messy and complex, but it also is a far more accurate expression of how we think, how we, the users, think about the world. It's bottom up instead of top down. It's rich instead of narrowed. And it's incredibly messy as opposed to being highly ordered and unambiguous. But the bottom up expresses something that the top down misses, which is the richness of the connections and the messiness of the meanings that we as a world share.